So there's a term that if you're a girl, maybe you're not super familiar with. Guys, you probably know it. And actually, probably everybody knows it. If you're familiar with the show How I Met Your Mother, Emily really likes that show, apparently. There's this term they use a lot on that show. It's called bro code, right? Really what that is, that's just a weird way of saying there are man rules, right? Like there are rules that we as men understand. So for example, fellas, you'll agree with me on this. If you have a 3-seater couch and there are 2 of you, you sit on either end, right? You don't sit in the middle. Yeah. That's a man rule, right? There's no reason for us, especially in the summer with shorts on, to be rubbing legs and sitting next to each other in the heat when you can separate yourself, right? Now, I know what's going to happen. Some of you guys, you're going to come to my house, you're going to break the rule on purpose. And that's okay, because I'll make it super awkward for you, okay? I'll get really into it and have a lot of fun with it. But where these rules are very important, right? A lot of these rules are stupid. They're not a big deal. But one of the places these rules are incredibly important are in the men's room, okay? Because the couch rule, you guys are like, what is he talking about? The couch rule also applies to urinals, okay? Because here's what happens. If you go into the men's room and there is a row of urinals, you are by yourself. You do not take the middle one, right? Because what's going to happen, you're going to force some other dude to have to stand right next to you. You automatically go to an edge. Now, if you're forced to use the middle one, that's fine, because another man rule is your eyes stay forward, right? When you are at the urinal or in the men's room in general, you are not viewing everything in the room. You are not just checking things out like, oh, look at that. That's really cool paint color. Like, you keep your eyes in front of you. Now, I just tend to assume that most guys know these rules, right? And most people tend to. But one time, I was on a trip and I was supervising some students, and we were in Washington, D.C., and we went to Arlington National Cemetery. We had been on the road a lot, so everybody has to go to the bathroom. So we take, myself and some other adults, we take these teenagers, they're all, we're all waiting our turns to go to the bathroom because the place is packed. And to my horror, what I see are the teenagers in our crew are looking everywhere. And they are standing behind perfect strangers as strangers are standing at the urinal, like no personal space, and talking around them to other people. They are walking around the bathroom and just looking for their friends and carrying on conversations all over the place. And guys, I don't get embarrassed very easily. I was mortified, right? Because in that moment, I'm thinking, someone is going to get murdered, right? Like, this is a serious, serious problem. So in that moment, I have one of 2 choices, right? Because at the end of the day, this is conflict, okay? Like, this is a big deal. You do not break these rules. I can ignore it, because after all, they're teenagers, they just don't know better. Or I can embrace the awkward conversation. I can sit down with teenagers who are not my own teenagers and explain to them just why it is that you should not be walking and looking all around in the men's room, and just why it is that you probably shouldn't stand a foot away from a man who is peeing, right? Like, maybe, just maybe, we need to have this conversation. So in that moment, here's what happened. I embraced the awkward, right? Some of us adults had to sit down and have a conversation with them to make sure they knew these are rules that you can never, ever, 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 ever again break. From now on, you understand when you walk into the men's room, here are the rules of the men's room, right? Now, here's why we have that conversation. Here's ultimately why I have that conversation with the teenager, why you have awkward conversations with people you work with, why you have awkward conversations with your spouse, with your friends, with your boss sometimes. Here's why. Is because we understand this. No one moves forward without confrontation. No one. Right? No one moves forward without confrontation. If I don't tell them they're breaking the rules, they don't know they're breaking the rules. And they find it out the hard way some other time, right? If you do not have the awkward confrontation with your spouse, they continually do what drives you nuts until one day you wake up and stab them in the face, right? Because that's what married people do. There's no middle lane, right? It's either talk about it or I kill you, right? If you do not embrace the awkward conversation with a coworker who's constantly doing something they should not do, either they end up fired or you end up looking incompetent, right? No one moves forward without confrontation. It just doesn't happen. But here's the key we're really going to focus in on today. This is what is so important about confrontation, is that we confront who we love. We confront who we love. So on a side note, can I tell you that maybe the place to do confrontation isn't on some public comment forum on a news site's website or on Facebook? Because I have no business confronting people that I don't love. Now, it doesn't mean I can't confront injustice. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying when it comes to a matter of opinion, maybe we reserve that for the people that we love, right? Because we confront who we love. That's why Proverbs 27:6, you've heard me say this a bunch of times, but Proverbs 27:6 says, faithful are the wounds of a friend, right? The wounds of a friend can be trusted. A friend will hurt you to help you, but it says profuse are the kisses of an enemy. In other words, like they're just going to tell you what you want to hear, and that's going to sound good in the moment, but it's actually terrible for you, right? Wounds from a friend can be trusted. A friend will hurt you ultimately to help you. So when we're confronted by someone that we love or someone that loves us, or we're confronting someone in love, the goal is to do this, to do confrontation in a way that it's all done in love. So here's what we want to answer today is how do we confront people in love? How do we do it? How do we do it when somebody has offended us or maybe offended our spouse or somebody has done something that as a Christian we would say, hey, this is offensive to God, offensive to the character and nature of God. How do we lovingly confront them? And what I love about the Bible is the Bible just doesn't give us examples on how super spiritual life can be, but the Bible also shows us how some of the most practical things are also some of the most spiritual things you'll go through in your life. Because confrontation is all through the Bible. In fact, it's where we're going to be today in Galatians chapter 2, and we're going to start in verse 11. Now, just to give you a little background on where we are, Galatians is written by Paul, and Paul is writing in part because there are people in this region of churches that are trying to discredit him. They're trying to say that he's not important, that he's not a big deal, that we shouldn't listen to him. They're trying to discredit his teaching. So part of what he has to do is to remind them, hey, no, I love you, but I also have some authority, right? Like I am who I say I am. So right before this in Galatians chapter 2, what Paul does is he says, hey, I sat down with the pillars of the church. I sat down with Peter, James, and John, right? Peter, you're also going to see the Bible uses his name also as Cephas, right? I sat down with these three men, and they heard my testimony, my story. They heard what we wanted to do, what myself and Barnabas wanted to do, and they fully affirmed us and said, yes, we're behind you. We're sending you out. Just do not forget that you should not neglect the poor. And Paul says, of course, why would we neglect the poor, right? Because the poor to the early church, they were not seen as a problem. They were seen as people to be loved and nurtured. And so he says, hey, of course we won't forget the poor. And right on the tail end of this is where we get now in verse 11, Paul just does something that seems like he's jumping ahead of himself. He's just been affirmed, just been set apart for ministry. And notice what it says here in the first part of verse 11. It says, but when Cephas, also Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him. I opposed him. In other words, I let him know there was something wrong in his life. Paul is engaging Peter, one of the pillars of the church, in confrontation, which gives us our first point today if you're taking notes. If you want to do loving confrontation, you got to understand this. This has to go under all of it. No one is above being confronted. No one is above being confronted. There is no title in the world that you can give yourself that puts you above being confronted. It does not happen. Everyone is able to be confronted. All right, so think about this from Paul's perspective. He's just been set apart for ministry. He's the outsider coming in. He didn't physically walk with Jesus the way that Peter, James, and John did. So now he's going to these people who walked with Jesus for 3 years, and he's entrusting his message, his ministry to them. They set him out, and then immediately Paul is opposing, confronting Peter. This is the same Peter who walked on water. This is the same Peter who gave up everything to physically follow Jesus. This is the same Peter who would preach at Pentecost and thousands of people would decide to follow Jesus. This is that Peter. He wasn't just one of the 12, but even in the 12 disciples, Jesus had an inner circle of 3. But even in that inner circle, we can see that Jesus spent more time with Peter and developing Peter than any other disciple. Peter is the pillar amongst the pillars of the early church. And yet, even with that, Paul opposes him. he confronts him. No one is above being confronted. Now, I do want to give you a filter to understand this through, though, right? Because in our day and age, I do not think that confrontation is more prevalent, but I do think it's more readily available to you, right? So in other words, you can post something on the internet today, and somebody you haven't talked to in 5 years can decide to confront you about it, right? So how do we filter through if we're being confronted, right? Because honestly, we need to be. If we're being confronted, how do I filter through whether or not I should listen to this? So I've got 2 questions for you to consider when somebody confronts you. First one is this. This is specifically for the Christians in the room, people who decided to follow Jesus. First question is, do they love Jesus? Do they love Jesus? Because here's why. Here's why that's such an important question, is there are things that I believe as a follower of Jesus that do not line up with the value system of the world around me. But I do not look to the world around me to affirm my value system. Doesn't happen. So if somebody disagrees with me, I have a lot of friends that are not Christians and would not even say they're close to considering it, okay? So there have been things they've confronted me on, and I love them, and so I'll listen to them, but I do not have to treasure that disagreement and that confrontation in my heart, because our value system is different. The way we see the world is different. I'm not going to celebrate what God would tell me should break my heart. Nor am I going to let break my heart what God says we should celebrate. And so do they love Jesus? If you're a follower of Jesus, that question matters. But this next question is for all of us. It's, do they love me? Because guys, honestly, a lot of times we don't ask ourselves this question. We don't ask ourselves if they actually love me. We just kind of assume that everybody gets to talk to us now because everybody has access to us all the time. They can send us a text message, right? So many people have my number, okay? Have my phone number. Like one time we sent it out on a mailer on accident. So the entire, there's thousands of people in Akron that have my phone number. No joke. And I'll get calls every once in a while. And they're like, oh, you're the pastor guy. Yep, that's me. I sent you my phone number 4 years ago because I'm an idiot. Confrontation is so readily available, but we really do need to ask ourselves the question, okay, they're confronting me, but do they love me? Because there are people that I like and that I respect, but their confrontation to me means very little. Because while I can like and respect them, sometimes they have an agenda. And it's not about making me better. It's not about bringing me closer to God and closer to His plan for my life. Do they love me? Because if they don't, it doesn't matter. In fact, I'll tell you this one story. I worked for a guy one time who it became very clear to me that while he loved me, he did not love my wife. Because he was trying to confront my wife through me. And he went on to tell me one time, he said, I probably shouldn't share this. He said, he's like, one of the churches I worked at, a board member, pointed his finger in my wife's face and he called her a B word. He said, and I just had to take it. I said, that's the difference between you and me. Because if you stuck your finger in my wife's face and said anything, I'd break your finger, right? Right, because here's the deal. At that point, that confrontation tells me there's no love here. So we don't have to listen to every bit of confrontation. We don't have to take all of it seriously, right? Do they love Jesus? That's important for followers of Jesus. But do they love me? That's important for every single one of us, right? No one is above being confronted, but not all confrontation is created equally. All right, now, in verse 11 here, though, this is a treasure trove, right? Because you would think, well, that's got to be it for one verse of Scripture. But no, there's more because he continues with this. It says, when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him how? To his face. I opposed him. I confronted him to his face. You want to talk about awkward? There are few things in life for us culturally as awkward as that. Here's why. Some of us are afraid to answer our phones. That's not just a few of us. This is a growing cultural problem. People get terrified when their phone rings. Some of us don't like checking email because we're afraid of what we might find on the other side of the email. Some of us will get a text message, and instead of responding back, we will think about it for, no joke, guys, multiple days. Because we want to get the wording just right. And so in our desire to control things, we have lost the art of how to confront. So here's one of the biggest rules with confrontation, if you're taking notes, is that face-to-face is always better than unnecessary space. Face-to-face is always better than unnecessary space. Now hear me, if you are having to confront because you're in an abusive relationship, please do not go face-to-face, okay? But for most of us, that's not the confrontation in your life. So for us, face-to-face is better than unnecessary space. We have to be willing to put on our big boy and big girl pants to not just send somebody a text message passive-aggressively, or, call them and hope they don't answer so we can leave them a voicemail. Call when we know they can't answer so we can leave them a voicemail. We've got to be willing, if we love them, if we're talking about loving confrontation, we've got to be willing to do this face to face. So Paul opposes Peter to his face. And so here's why. Because when we oppose somebody face to face, they gather things information-wise that they cannot gather simply from a text, simply from an email, simply from a letter. Because if I confront you face to face, guess what? You get to see my tone. You get to hear my tone. You get to feel the tone of my body language, right? But if it's just there to be read, all of that stuff, you get to determine what it means. In fact, we're going to put this up on the screen. This is a confrontation I had a few years ago.
That's a good one, man.
So not there?
Good job.
Next slide there. So we had a guy in our church. This is about 4 years ago. Okay? I like this guy. Love this guy. But he was terrorizing people in our church. Like he was making people flat out want to leave our church because he was just being so mean. So when you read this, every single one of you, I would almost guarantee, read it slightly different than the person next to you. Because when you just read it, you get to determine tone. You get to determine the volume of my voice. You get to determine how it should be felt. But can I tell you, here's how this went. I invited the guy over and took him out to get a milkshake. Okay? How loving is confrontation if you include a milkshake? Like that's pretty great, right? Like I can handle just about any confrontation with a milkshake. And I took him out and here's what I said. Okay, I said, hey, I need you to know, man, I'm trusting you don't mean to, but you're coming off like a jerk. And what you're doing is you're hurting people, and I'm guessing you don't mean to, but you're really hurting people. You're coming off like a jerk. Now, when I say that, that might sound different than how it felt when you read it the first time, right? Some of you might have saw that and went, you're coming off like a jerk, right? No. I was able to say something hard, but say it in love. But if that was a text message, that ain't going over so well, right? So face-to-face is always better than unnecessary space because we do not want to give other people the opportunity to decide how we feel. I do not want other people to think that I'm writing them off when I'm trying to extend to them something better, right? Face-to-face is always better than unnecessary space, which leads us to our next point. The reason face-to-face is so important is that confrontation is best when it points to grace. Confrontation is best when it points to grace. Can I tell you, if you are going into confrontation, more times than not, already deciding that you are not willing to forgive and you are not willing to move forward, you are wrong. Now, that does not mean that I confront and everything goes back to the way it was. That's not it. Right? What it means is I've got to be willing, if I'm willing to confront somebody, to at times give them the benefit of the doubt, to at times believe the best about them even when their behavior would say otherwise, right? Confrontation is best when it points to grace because here's the rest of verse 11 in Galatians chapter 2. He says, when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. Because he stood condemned. In other words, here's what Paul realized, is that Peter has not just offended me, but he has also offended God, and so it's time that somebody loves him enough to point out to him the error of his ways. Because Peter was being a hypocrite. In fact, here's what it says in verse 13 there of chapter 2, or verse 12, I'm sorry. It says, for before certain men came from James, that's the Jewish crowd, right? Before people came from James, Peter was eating with the Gentiles, the outsiders of the church. church. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. So here's what happens, is Peter is hanging out with these newer Christians, people who would be considered outsiders, but once the insiders show up, once the cool kids show up, he stays away from them. He's being a hypocrite. But his problem is not just hypocrisy, it's also that his hypocrisy is leading other people into hypocrisy. Because it says in verse 13, and the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas, even this guy who was set apart with Paul, was led astray by their hypocrisy. So the problem, the reason that Peter stood condemned, the reason that God would have a problem with Peter is because Peter's not just acting hypocritically, but he's leading others to be hypocritical. So I want you to notice this. Notice this next part here. Verse 14. He says, but when I saw their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel. Pause there. When I saw their actions weren't in step with God's laid out plan for them, when I saw that their conduct, their behavior, their attitude was not in step with what God would have for them. Notice, Paul's just not personally offended, right? Because there's some things, guys, let's be honest. This, once again, this is your big boy, big girl pants. There are some things that are offensive to you that at times we just need to get over. We don't have to confront every single little thing, right? Like we don't have to be outraged by every single little thing. If somebody, oh my gosh, somebody posts something on Facebook I disagree with, I don't need to blow my lid, all right? Sometimes we just got to get over it. It's better sometimes to overlook an offense. But Paul says, no, this offense is big enough. It needs to be addressed. So he says, once I saw their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas, to Peter, before them all. Now this is what's really tough for us, because all of us at one time or not have thought that if we're going to lovingly confront somebody, it always has to be behind closed doors. But a public offense many times requires a public confrontation. Because we can't pretend, especially for a guy like me, okay, let's think about it this way. I have known plenty of pastors who have had to resign from their church because they've had a what we call a moral failure. Okay, here's what that means. Sometimes that means they were having an affair with people in the church or outside of the church. Sometimes that means they were doing something inappropriate financially, whatever it is, right? Now here's the thing. There's a reason that these discussions and the outcome of those discussions isn't all done behind closed doors. Because that transgression affected everyone publicly. So it's got to be addressed publicly, confronted publicly, right? If I scream at my wife in front of all of you, I don't just get to say I'm sorry to my wife. I have to also apologize to you, because you deserve better than that from a friend and from a pastor, right? So he says, I confronted him in front of them all. And then here's what he points to. He says, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, in other words, here's all he's saying is you're one of the chosen Jewish people, right? Like that's what he thinks. But yet you live with the freedom like these outsiders the Gentiles live with. That's what you do. How can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? In other words, why are you placing a heavy burden on other people? He's confronting the attitude, the behavior, the pattern. He says, we ourselves, you and me, we're Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners, yet we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. And then he just goes on to repeat that about 3 different ways. And here's really what he's getting at, is he's once again confronting publicly the pattern and the behavior. And he's saying, because it's not in step with the conduct of the gospel, we can do better. But what does he do? He points him to the gospel, to the good news about Jesus Christ. And here's why. Because the gospel always points to grace. The gospel always points to grace. So Peter, in Paul's estimation, stood condemned, but he didn't have to stay that way. He got to point him to grace, to say, hey, here's what Jesus has done for you. Therefore, man, we can do this better. We can be better than this. It doesn't have to stay this way. We can move forward from here. The gospel always points us to grace, which leads us to the last point this morning, if you're taking notes, and that's this, that confrontation is a gift. Confrontation is a gift. So hear me, if you're not willing to confront somebody, you're robbing them of a gift. If you're not willing to listen to healthy, loving confrontation, you are robbing yourself of a gift, because confrontation is a gift. In fact, one of the most just sticks out in my brain the most. I was 18 years old, and I felt called to be a pastor. And so I was getting ready that summer to move from Cincinnati, Ohio to Cleveland, Tennessee, right? It's not as big as Cleveland, Ohio, believe it or not. Cleveland, Tennessee, to train to become a pastor. And so my youth pastor said, hey, I'd love for you to just come and serve in the youth ministry now. Like, you just graduated, let's make you a youth leader. You can serve, give you some access to me, you can learn a lot. Cool, let's do that. So he had one rule, really, for youth leaders that was very important. It was this. It was an integrity rule, right? That as a youth leader, you do not flirt with or date kids in the youth ministry. Now, that was easy for the youth leaders who were in their 30s, I would hope. But at 18, I'm hanging out with 16, 17, 18-year-old girls. That was not so easy for me. So I thought I was slick. I would just flirt with these girls, right? Like, who would ever know that this was happening? Everybody, because 18-year-olds are not that smooth, especially me. And so one night we were hanging out. There's a bunch of us at this youth group thing, and this girl that I was crushing on pretty hard, she had forgotten something at the church, and so she was trying to figure out who would take her to go back to the church. And of course, knight in shining armor, right? I've got my 76 Ford Maverick. Girl, I can take you back to the church, right? So my youth pastor sees us walking towards my car. The next few minutes were pretty scary, okay? He pulled me aside, right? And he had somebody else drive her, and he pulled me aside. And I'll be honest, I don't remember exactly what he said. I just remember that is probably as close as I've come as an adult to wetting my own pants, okay? Because he let me have it. He didn't say anything disrespectful. He didn't say anything mean. He just told me the truth at a higher volume than maybe I was used to. And here's what I do remember, is coming away from that conversation, what I knew was, if I am willing to break my integrity here, I'll be willing to break my integrity somewhere else. And I had committed, this was the rule that I had committed to. And if I break this one, who's to say I'm not going to break the next one? And can I tell you now, that was 14 years ago. 14 years ago, I had other youth leaders that served under me that I fired for breaking this rule, right? And I fired them with a lot of volume, all right? But that rule, somebody confronting me at 18 years old, I can't imagine how much trouble that saved me from. Might not sound like a big deal to you, but it's a big deal to me. I can't imagine just how much of a gift that confrontation actually was in the moment. And I love what the writer of Hebrews says. He says in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 11, he says, for the moment, all discipline, all confrontation seems painful rather than pleasant. In the moment, all of it hurts. Doesn't matter if it's bad confrontation or good confrontation. In the moment, all of it hurts. But later, I mean, sometimes, guys, with confrontation, you've got to be willing to give it time. Later, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. And I don't want you to miss that word, trained. Because if you're training in something, you're not doing it once, but you're engaging with it time and time and time again. Confrontation is a gift when we decide I'm not going to hide from it, I'm not going to run from it, but I'm going to go in, I'm going to take this thing head on, and I'm going to do my best to learn from it. Confrontation is a gift. So for us, let's remind ourselves here the big idea, right? We confront who we love. So the question for us is, who needs confronting? Now, I'm not asking you to run out of here, guns blazing, and just start yelling at people, okay? That guy, right? Just start screaming at people. We have 10 people walk out of the room at one time to yell at some guy who just littered on Market Street. That's not what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking for you to really consider, because here's what I'm guessing is true of you. Is there's confrontation that has needed to be done for you, and for whatever reason, you've held off. There's a conversation that maybe you've needed to have that for whatever reason, you haven't had it yet. Maybe it's not a problem with somebody else, though. Maybe there's also the fact that you need to confront yourself on something. Maybe for you, there's been a problem, it's been staring you in the face, and every time it stares you in the face, you push it off to the side and act like, well, it'll be okay. maybe, just maybe, you need to confront yourself and love yourself enough to confront yourself. But also, maybe, just maybe, right now, God's confronting you on something because he loves you so much. I think this is where it gets incredibly difficult for us. Because for us, guys, God loves us enough to confront us. And with God, like, we can pretend everything's okay, like with ourselves, but God knows better. And so for us, maybe your next step might just be a courageous next step of admitting where you're wrong with God and saying, God, I need your help. We confront who we love, so maybe it's time to love yourself enough to be honest with yourself and allow God not just to confront you, but for you to confront your own patterns, your own behavior, your own sin.